Welcome to our epic ocean, where critical solutions to a planet in peril are brought to the surface. Our epic ocean celebrates all that is epic about the ocean and why it is the planet's most vital resource. And now to our host, Rich Gurman.
Back in 2017, I started my nonprofit, Project O. I had a strong passion to protect the ocean and the sacred life that calls it home, but honestly, I had no idea what the heck to do and what to focus on. A dear friend of mine who's also extremely active in the conservation space gave me a book and said, read this, maybe it'll give you some ideas. The book was 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, written by David Helvarg. Fast forward to last month, the New York Times ran a guest essay, Warmer Oceans Threaten Another California Forest, this one underwater. The author wrote about how 200 miles of lush and critical kelp forest north of San Francisco's Golden Gate Bridge has all but disappeared. The author of that essay, David Helvarg. My team immediately reached out and asked if we can get him on the show to share his story, and he graciously agreed. David is the executive director of Blue Frontier, a collaborative movement committed to healthy coastlines and a thriving ocean. The prolific author of 6 books, including Blue Frontier, Saved by the Sea, and 50 Ways to Save the Ocean. He's also the organizer of the Blue Vision Summit and the Peter Benchley Ocean Awards. He's traveled the world as a journalist and correspondent, producing over 40 broadcast documentaries for PBS and Discovery. In addition to the New York Times, he's appeared in the LA Times, Smithsonian, NatGeo, and Popular Science. He is an active body surfer and a scuba diver, and more importantly, he's the early instigator of the Seaweed Rebellion, a grassroots movement to protect coastal and ocean ecosystems. David, welcome to our epic ocean. How the Helvarg are you?
I'm pretty good in a germane sort of way.
Touche, touche. So, David, it's an honor to have you here, and I know we're going to have a great conversation. I want to go into the specific projects that you were focused on, but I want to start with some background. You were born in New York City, the son of refugees. Your mother left Nazi Germany, and your father escaped civil war in Ukraine. First of all, the current events of today must really hit home for you, huh?
Yeah, it's really disturbing. I think my father was 8 and they escaped a massacre in their village. His mother and his sister hid in a hay wagon, and then he was carrying his 6-year-old sister on his back through the wheat stubble in the winter. And I think 100 years later, and there are 6 and 8-year-old kids who are facing the same trauma, and how things change, but they don't. It's just a horrific reality that continues, and right after, some circumstances change. Right after the war broke out, I wrote a piece for the San Francisco Chronicle on how one way to fight Putin is decarbonize. The fossil fuel dictatorships today are Russia and Venezuela, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and we had a war in '73, the Arab-Israeli war, where there was a oil boycott, and that could have been a sign for us to start to get off fossil fuels. We were already realized at that time what was happening. The science was becoming clear. Exxon was in the leadership in understanding the science and suppressing it. But, we let it continue, and we created these warfare states based on oil and gas. One of my books, Rescue Warriors, I was, with the Coast Guard, some of their best cutters guarding offshore Iraqi oil terminals in the Persian Gulf. And I'm on the bridge at night with a 24-year-old XO for the cutter. He's like, all this death, he says, and it's tragedy if it's for oil. And then he goes, but maybe it's not, because they're mostly exporting to Korea and elsewhere. And I said, well, maybe it is. We've become, the United States kind of became the guardians of a global system of trade in fossil fuels. And you can't blame people living in the past that coal and oil were great energy systems for the 16th and the 19th century, but it's the 21st, and we have alternatives, and a lot of what we do is talking about the connections now between the ocean and the climate, but also the climate stresses and the wars we face. And it's definitely challenging times that we're living through.
That's so true. Yeah, and we'll get into all this, and I really want to get into your books and, as a journalist, what you've done to really shine the light on these issues. But I like hearing a little bit more about your background. I watched a presentation where you described a family trip to Key West, Florida, which, by the way, was the place that I lived before moving here to Laguna Beach. And in Key West, you experienced firsthand the magnificent world under the surface of the ocean. How did a kid from New York City and Long Island fall in love with the ocean? And did it happen on that trip in Key West?
Well, first I defend my home waters, my natal waters of New York. Grew up in New York City, Long Island. It was like 80% of that city is disconnected from the continental mainland. So I grew up, I'd say I grew up pestering my mom to take us to Jones Beach on Long Island. And my fourth grade teacher, Mrs. Olson, brought in her dad was a sea captain. She brought in these big sawfish bills. And it was my sudden realization that Long Island was, in fact, an island. And some 40 years later, I'm talking to a bunch of fourth graders in New York, and one of them raises her hands. She's like 10-year-old. I go, "What is it?" She goes, "Is that a real island?" I goes, "What a real island? What you said Brooklyn's and Queens was a part of?" So I love the ocean as a kid, but, it was still rough Atlantic Ocean. And I thought that, I'd sometimes look up at the stars, feel like I was a generation too soon to explore alien worlds. And then, when I was 15 for my sister's 18th birthday, my mom took us down to the Florida Keys, and driving over what was then just the 2-lane intra-ocean highway and looking out at that aquamarine waters, I felt like I'd come home to a place I'd never been before. And we stopped at Santelli's, which was a first dolphin training place. Later, I discovered that the CIA was also keeping its dolphins there. But there were only about 30 of us. They were doing the show, and they had the dolphin that was the original Flipper from the movie. Said, "Anybody want to swim with Flipper?" So I stripped down to my jeans. I jumped in. I got dragged around by a dolphin. And by the time, so I was already stoked. We got into Key West, put up at the Key Wester, and I got a mask and snorkel, got hold of that. And suddenly went off the seawall, and there's that alien world I'd always looked for. I mean, living, colorful rocks and a shoaling little hammerhead and shoaling fish and sea turtles. And it was amazing. And it was just the beginning of what would mostly turn out to a schizophrenic life, turn into a schizophrenic life when I became a reporter and spent the next, 40 years or so going off to cover wars and epidemics so I could come home to body surf or go for a dive.
Yeah, I've probably done that drive from Miami to Key West. Gosh, probably a couple hundred times. It's just something about driving basically over the ocean, and you have the Gulf of Mexico on one side and the Atlantic Ocean on the other. It's a beautiful drive and a pretty cool destination to get to. So how did this, your time in New York, and I appreciate that it's funny because I don't think most people think of New York City as an island, which it is.
It's the big oyster.
It's a big oyster, and your impression of that 10-year-old student was spot on, by the way. But how did your time in New York City and then this, visiting this alien land or ocean water, I should say, in Key West, how did that lead to you becoming so intimately involved with the issues that threaten the health of the ocean and the planet?
Well, as I said, it took a long time. I mean, I thought as a kid and even going into college that, I would be an oceanographer or somehow connect, study the oceans. But, one thing growing up, the son of, Holocaust survivors, was realizing that history can kick the struts out from under you at any time. And I ended up when I was 17, I was in Chicago at a police riot when I was there to protest the war, and things escalated. I got very involved in the 60s. Chicago's where I first experienced tear gas and blunt force trauma. And by the time I was in college, I thought that there was going to be urban guerrilla warfare. I thought that was going to be a revolution to stop the war that seemed unstoppable in Vietnam and the racism at home. And by the time early 70s, I realized that wasn't going to happen. The war was de-escalating. I was still curious what urban guerrilla warfare looked like. I went to Northern Ireland, got credentials to go there as a reporter at 21. Quickly realized the old axiom that in war, truth's the first casualty. And my sympathies didn't matter at all because everyone was not only willing but delighted to lie to me. The British, the Protestants, the Catholic IRA. So I had to become an investigative reporter. I realized that, kind of claimed a new cause, which was the public's right to know, and continued to work, for years, covering 5 years in Central America, covering their wars and along the coast, but always looking for opportunities to report on ocean conditions, whether it was shrimp smuggling on the Gulf of Fonseca or offshore oil development in California. And I continued working around a number of issues, and I said, coming home to get in the water. Eventually, I became a TV producer. I was covering a lot of issues like the Navy and offshore oil, and did a documentary with friend Steve Talbot for KQD for the PBS here in the Bay Area called Who Bombed Judy Barry. This was when an Earth First activist had a pipe bomb placed in her car, and she was accused of being the perpetrator, not the victim. Our documentary showed that she really had been the target. And out of that, somebody asked me to do a book. I ended up doing my first book, was called The War Against the Greens, about the environmental backlash of the 1990s, which gave me an opportunity. Took a while, but eventually wrote the book on the ocean I'd always wanted to write. Kind of used my skills as an investigative reporter to look at the, fraud and abuse involved in a lot of ocean activity and policy, and but also with balancing the warning with the wonder. I mean, just the pleasure and the history and the experience of it. And it gave me an excuse to go, release sharks in the Keys and do some fun dives down to Aquarius. And
nice.
And that book came out right at a time when I was losing my partner, life love, who got breast cancer, in her 40s. And so the book came out right around the time that Nancy passed. And I was thinking I might, this was when George Bush was ginning up to invade Iraq, George Bush Jr. And I thought that I might go back to war reporting. I knew that was a good antidote to depression. And then I got a call out of the blue from Ralph Nader, who'd read my book, Blue Frontier. And like the last chapter is called The Seaweed Rebellion. It's about marine grassroots and finding solutions at the local level, but not yet being able to scale them up to where they could effectively help turn the tide. And he encouraged me to sort of do my reporting, take the journalism reporting on the disasters and try and work on solutions. So I called a lot of people I knew, fishermen, activists, surfers, whoever, see if there'd be interest in kind of building a common coalition, which there seemed to be, and kind of finally decided that we're always going to have wars. We're not always going to have healthy reefs or kelp. Plus, I'd inherited the cat, so the Poos, who didn't even like getting her paws wet, but I didn't know what to do with her if I went off to war. So I think the cat determined my life course for the last 20 years.
Wow. So first of all, thank you for sharing about Nancy. I'm sure even all these years later, that's a hard story to recall. And what I'm hearing is you use your knowledge and expertise as a journalist to kind of lift the veil behind your true passion, which was protecting the ocean that you and I both love so much, right? That was kind of the vehicle to help spread the word on what was really going on. And I'm assuming in this all led to the creation of Blue Frontier. Is that correct?
Right. We established nonprofit, and I just figured, in the environmental spirit of recycling, why not name it after the book? So
makes sense.
set up Blue Frontier. One of the first things we did was create it was first in print because this was early in the internet era. So we created an ocean and coastal conservation guide listing about 2,000 organizations and agencies and parks involved in ocean coastal protection. Began networking. Today it's a Blue Movement directory online. And then started bringing people together. Are one of our first of now 6 Blue Vision summits in 2004, kind of brought grassroots people, hundreds of grassroots people from around the nation mainly. It was a largely U.S. focus, to Washington, where we began our first Healthy Ocean Hill Day and lobbying and working with the House Ocean Caucus and others. And, connecting policymakers with activists and with different sectors, to bring the fishing community together with the ports community and have the Coast Guard engaged with grassroots people. And I think it was a success, I realized, when Devon Quirlo, who had started, Craig and Devon had started Reef Relief down in the Florida Keys, protect the coral. And she had just met with the head of Save the Sound, activist from Puget Sound. She said, and we talked about all the problems we're having and the bureaucrats and the difficulty of fundraising and the challenges and how disgusting it all was. And I felt so much better, she says. So I think sometimes just realizing you're not
alone,
not alone in your struggles and the difficulties. And, it's lots of people pushing together that finally start to make a difference, or we hope make a difference.
Exactly. And I think that's a good point to speak to why you created it in the first place. And let's back up a second. You are the executive director of Blue Frontier, and I want to acknowledge you as someone that has his own nonprofit. It's not an easy thing to create and sustain and fundraise for and all these things. It's a complicated process, but I want to congratulate you and acknowledge you on 20 years in existence. I think that's right now is your 20-year anniversary. Is that correct?
Yeah, we started in 2002, and we're celebrating 20 years. What there's to celebrate? I mean, I thought after 30 years of as a freelance journalist, how could I start? What career could be more lucrative? I know, start a nonprofit. But so clearly we're not in it for the. I mean, honestly, I did think that a lot of it would be like politics and beach parties. I hadn't thought of spreadsheets and endless meetings, but sometimes you have to do what you have to do and hope that you get enough beach time. I mean, periodically I just have to get in the water because that's the one place I'm optimistic is,
I hear you on that one. And that's a daily occurrence. So let's talk about your organization more, and we'll get into the summit and policy and things like that. You have a board of directors that includes some incredible people: Charlotte Vick, Wendy Benchley, Vicki Nichols Goldstein, who actually sits on my board of directors also. And you have an advisory board that includes Dr. Sylvia Earle, who I just interviewed, Wallace J. Nichols, who I also interviewed, Serge Dedina, who's the mayor of Imperial Beach down. It's a border town, southern.
Yep, San Diego, Mexico.
You can go. Yeah, yep. Exactly. As far south as you can go in San Diego. Serge is a friend. Greg and Barb McGilvery, who are legendary filmmakers and neighbors of mine and friends here in Laguna Beach. So you got all these amazing people. And you started talking about the collaborative impact of what you're doing, how you're really providing resources and opportunities to anyone, to everyday citizens who care about the coast and the ocean and want to really be a part of that decision-making process to hopefully lead, like you said, to positive impact. How does this work? And share, if you can, some of the impact that you are making.
Sure. We're trying to provide tools, as you say, to citizen activists. I believe, change comes from the top down and the bottom up, but mainly from the bottom up. So, and because we're a small organization, we can be, flexible so that we're able to adapt to changing needs. We've had, as I mentioned earlier, a number of these Blue Vision summits in D.C., where we sort of built the largest citizen lobbies for the ocean. We go up and metrics are sometimes hard, but for example, one year they had the pirate fishing bill to crack down on, they call it IUU, illegal, unregulated, illegal, unregulated, whatever.
Another vowel.
Another vowel.
Bad fishing, yes.
Bad fishing, pirate fishing, basically, taking more than the ocean can provide. And so we got up on the hill, and Sam Farr, who's one of our ocean champions, his staff told me that, they had 22 co-sponsors for the bill on the day we arrived, and they had over 40 the next day. And a lot of it was even just going in, and a lot of, it's a busy place up there, lots of bills, lots of activity. A lot of people just didn't know.
That's right.
And so, we've worked to just get funding for frontline agencies like NOAA and the Coast Guard and Fish and Wildlife when they've been threatened. Mostly we built, networks that people discovered they could be empowered in different ways. It's inside, outside. You can both be on the streets and on Capitol Hill or in your state house. So we've done lots of lobbying. We also organized in 2018 the first global March for the Ocean that took place in DC and 26 other countries, and also in inland places, because every state's a coastal state. We did and continue to do what we call the Blue Beat, which is just a continuation of my journalism. I think the Blue Beat is saying that, the only resource in the ocean not fully exploited is good storytelling. And both telling those stories in print and video, but also providing, in recent years, media training for scientists, for activists, for youth activists to learn how to communicate with journalists, and also how to tell stories and how to turn their data and campaigns into, human stories. Because people like Sylvia Earle, they can love fish and groupers, but most people don't love groupers, but they might love a person who's dedicated to groupers, dedicated to sharks, like Peter Benchley was. Peter was everybody knew him as the author of Jaws, and thought that all the sharks that were killed after the movie came out. But Peter dedicated most of his life to protecting sharks and their habitat, and keynoted our first summit. When he passed on, we had the Blue Frontier Awards. We met with Wendy, his widow, and, like Nancy had been with me, dive buddy, and decided to start an oceans awards that lasted 10 years and basically became the Academy Awards of the Ocean. Everyone from heads of state to youth activists and grassroots folks, and created a network of 86 winners around the globe who still have an ongoing network where you begin to get people who are, heads of state, like Macky Sall of Senegal, or Anote Tong when he was president of Kiribati, or the presidents of Costa Rica or Monaco, and get them meeting the best scientists or the best media people or the best youth activists. And essentially, the ocean kind of erodes stovepipes. What I've found is that people in one sector overlap. When I go and write about the ports, the port complex in LA or Long Beach, I'd find that the head of security at the Maersk port was also a surfer and a member of the Surf Rider Foundation. Or I'd be out with the Navy, and the air control chief really wanted to grow up to be an oceanographer and wanted me to start identifying animals he was seeing in off his deck, like mola molas and turtles. And so, we take the same approach. I'd say that, what we've done successfully is bringing people together around policy, connecting different sectors, different ocean sectors, so that they could start creatively addressing related issues. We did things like the first San Francisco, Coast Guard Day, where we got 700 coasties down to Pier 39, and thousands of locals got to see them do their operations, doing swimmers dropping out of helicopters and cutters they could board. And at the same time, the coasties and their families got discounts or, free admission to aquariums. connecting like environmentalists who are mostly focused on things such as salt marsh restoration or protecting sea turtles, putting them together with the directors of major ports, people like Geraldine Natz, who was the first woman and the first marine biologist to run a major port in LA and got the LA Long Beach port complex together to reduce air pollution 70%. And then became a model for a global greening ports movement. And again, where I work in Richmond, we've had for many years, we've fought for Point Melody, a 411-acre headland that also has the most pristine eelgrass beds in the bay. And in any other community would have been a park a generation ago, but because Richmond's a low-income community of color, it's been targeted first as a mega casino and more recently for luxury housing. And so you have these ongoing battles everywhere with frontline communities. We try and increase awareness of frontline communities at risk through our media work. We try and train people so they can do their own media work. We try and bring people together around policy. We try and bring people together just for celebrations of the sea, because you protect what you love. One of the early products we put out was our book, 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, because when I would go out and talk about the big issues, people would come up to me afterwards, go, well, what can I do about climate change or the collapse of marine wildlife? I've got a double course load. I'm looking for a job. Whatever it is, the answer was everything we do every day affects the seas around us. And so wrote 50 Ways to Save the Ocean because our choices in transportation, our food choices, what we choose to do when we visit the beach, all those things have impacts. And I found that the good news is when you start doing one or two good things for the ocean, turns out to be good for you, good for your pocketbook, good for your health, good for your spirit. And eventually you start with a few things that you know you can do, and you start getting a sense of empowerment. You begin working with others. You become a greater force. And pretty soon you have like no time for reality TV anymore because you're changing reality.
There you go. So what I'm hearing is you really are using storytelling, which is obviously a big focus of mine, and that's why you're here right now, is to continue to tell that story. But using storytelling to raise more awareness, using collaboration to bring people together from the Keys to Puget Sound and everywhere in between and the whole planet, to not only create more awareness but lead to action. And I like what you're saying about both a bottom up and a top-down approach happening at the same time. You mentioned policy a couple times. I think you and I both agree that we no longer have the luxury of time when it comes to solving the challenges of global climate shifts. Is enough being done from a policy standpoint? Is enough legislation being written? No,
of course not. And yet we dedicated the last 3 years. In 2019, the Green New Deal came out, looked at it and said, wait a minute, there's no blue here. So Blue Frontier partnered with the Center for the Blue Economy at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies. We brought 60 Californians together because I think California is a model of how to do right by your coast and ocean. Yes. From the state, from the different sectors that operate here, which is the ports, fishing, Navy, all of them. And then we had national feedback. We built a coalition that ranged from Jane Fonda to former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, to Robert Bowling, who's the sort of the father of environmental justice in America. And we built a ocean climate action plan, 4 sectors, and we began working on that over the last few years. I think we influenced the Biden administration. They've got the 130 by 30, which is protect 30% of our land and water by 2030. Mm-hmm. We encouraged a second 30 by 30, which is taking place, which is 30 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, because we need to rapidly transition so that, instead of fossil fuels in the Gulf of Mexico, we'll be developing, clean, renewable, and cheaper energy along the eastern seaboard and elsewhere in the Gulf, and seeing that transition. But we also had other proposals that went into, we helped contribute and did virtual lobbying during COVID to an Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act that was in the House, Much of that was taken up in the Build Back Better that passed the House that included, by last year, included a commitment of $6 billion a year to coastal restoration, $3 billion a year to greening ports and shipping, $1.5 billion a year that would have gone into a climate corps that would have engaged 300,000 18 to 25-year-olds in restoring our coast and other vital work. And it's frustrating, as I say, because in the end it was Joe Manchin, one Democrat, and 50 Republicans who didn't want to start a process. And 10 billion of 50 billion a year for doing the climate transition would be a very modest beginning, given that we're already suffering $50 billion a year of climate-related extreme weather damages to this, and that's just within the United States. So you get frustrated, but as I say, I'm not despairing. I'm more frustrated than despairing because we know what the solutions are. It's mobilizing the political will to enact them. So yes, 20 years ago when I started Blue Frontier, there was a House Ocean Caucus, and they distributed my 50 Ways book to every member of Congress, and they co-signed it, 3 Democrats, 3 Republican co-chairs. Those Republican environmentalists, pro-ocean guys like Gilchrist of Maryland and Saxon, New Jersey, they're all gone. They were, finding your pro-environmental Republican today, unfortunately, like finding an ivory-billed woodpecker.
Doesn't exist.
So the problem is when the oil and gas industry has captured one of the 2 major political parties in a 2-party system, it's really hard to make the changes that are needed. And yet we're still nonpartisan. The ocean historically has been a nonpartisan issue. We still see signs of that. In 2016, we launched the Sea Party. We had a 90-foot inflatable whale in front of the Capitol, and along with the usual suspects like Congressman, now retired, Sam Farr and Bill McKibben. We also had a congressman from South Carolina who was serious right-wing, Mark Sanford, member of the Freedom Caucus, but he represented a coastal district. So he was against offshore drilling. And it was great. The next day, the Post-Courier, which is the main newspaper in South Carolina, had a headline, Mark Sanford from Tea Party to Sea Party.
Was that before he got in trouble?
That was after he got in trouble as governor. And then he was congressman. And then because he wasn't Trumpian enough, he lost his seat. And because the Republican who was going to replace him, the Trumper, was pro-drilling, she lost to a Democrat in South Carolina. So there are some issues like healthy waters, clean beaches that you can take the kids to. Ralph Nader was telling me, he says, there's nobody who's going to go to the beach with their kids and sees it shut down by pollution and go, I'm okay with that because I'm anti-regulation.
Yeah, exactly.
It's still one of those issues that we hope can unify people. And we've seen it when there are issues like the threat of offshore oil. We've seen that people come together regardless of politics because they want to protect what they love.
That's right. So I want to ask you a question. You mentioned the word despair a little while ago. I've heard through the grapevine that you are a rare environmentalist who can exude both despair and hope at the same exact time. That's not easy to do. Can you offer some hope? I mean, you're in the trenches. You see what's really going on. You know what we're up against. Can you offer some hope to people who are, quite frankly, living in fear that the window to take action is closing on us?
I'd say my most hopeful book of the 6 was The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea. We're late maritime frontier, late in terms of European settlement, and did what maritime frontiers do, which is exterminate both indigenous people and wildlife. And really, we're taking things down. But by the 1960s, things had turned around. We were protecting the Channel Islands where animals could breed and feed. One example I give is by the end of the 19th century, after beating on the whales, we went after elephant seals for their oil. There were an estimated 20 to 100 left. In 1992, I visited this beach. 1992, its first elephant seal hauled up there, down by Hearst Castle. The next year, they had their first breeding pair. Last year, over 30,000 elephant seals returned to that one beach. There's incredible resilience in nature. You can push it too far, but California is an example of when when people make a commitment, and Californians all have this sense of entitlement, understanding the beach and ocean, it belongs to us all. And when you have that understanding, when you have a democracy of blue interest, California has the Navy, has surfers, has a world quality marine science complex, has the largest ports in the Western Hemisphere. When you have that mix, you have like rough family arguments, but everybody in the end comes out with good endpoints. We moved our world-class state park system into the water column, and we now protect 16% of our waters. I was talking earlier about cleaning up the ports. Well, the ports of LA, Long Beach, back a decade ago, the fence line communities were low-income communities of color. I mean, San Pedro and Wilmington and Long Beach. And they were suffering the highest rates of cancer and childhood asthma in the state from port pollution. They were suing the ports. No new construction was going on. None of the terminals were expanding. Geraldine came in. She held the first joint port commission meetings of the ports of LA and Long Beach since 1922. They passed a clean air agreement. They cleaned up 70% of the air within 5 years. The lawsuits went away. The terminals expanded. $1.5 billion a day of goods crossed those docks. Just one of multiple examples of when you do good by the environment, you're actually doing good by the environment and equity. And that's the solution. When you can, the bottom line, when you can make environment, economics, and fairness, equity align, you can do tremendous things. That's when there's hope. And that's where, that's one example of many. Now, the hope spots, as Sylvia calls them, they're too few. We haven't turned the curve yet, but the possibility is there. I see, in my own community of Richmond, we're in 15th year of a fight to save a 411-acre headland, including healthy eelgrass beds and 700 species of animals that we've identified. There's more ospreys there than anywhere else in the bay, breeding ospreys. And it's a battle. They first wanted to build that mega casino, then they wanted to build, now they want to build housing, but the community has other ideas. The community's like, especially during COVID, we'd opened up the beach and everybody from the community was bringing their kids down to the beach, and everybody got more invested. And now we're at a point where we think we've got a majority of the city council and we can finally turn things around, straighten out the legal mess that the outgoing mayor created, and have a park and an underpark community. And that would be and put the housing where it's needed downtown, where we have the infrastructure, and where you can have housing that's both market based and affordable, so you're not gentrifying the shoreline at the cost of the residents. You're opening the shoreline to all residents. And the reality is we bring like high school kids down there. We brought the health academy from Richmond High School. They were doing water quality testing under a tree by the water. Suddenly an osprey swoops down and grabs a fish out of the water, and the kids go ballistic. They're all cheering. That exposure. We just got our first boat donated to Blue Frontier. We're going to try and take kids out on the water, see it from a different perspective. And that's the hope. I mean, I'm also hopeful with young people today. There's so much energy. There's so much commitment. I mean, I'm so inspired by young people. I'm thinking of going out and getting my eyebrow pierced.
You're going to become young again. So let me stop you there, because I want to reiterate some of the things that you said. First of all, what I'm hearing from you, David, is that your hope is not based on blind faith. Your hope is based on actual results that you are seeing. And California, I'm with you, is a great model of that. I talk incessantly about the little town I live in, Laguna Beach, who in 2012, 10 years ago exactly, we took a stand to protect our coastline. And we have a 6-mile stretch, small area in the scheme of things, but where we, not only is it marine protected area, but you can't fish. It's a no-take zone. And the amount of life that we have right off the coast here, I always call it the greatest aquarium in the world. And it's a great example of what happens when we just leave the ocean alone. As you said, it has this incredible ability to restore itself. So we're seeing examples of that, which lead to your hope, which I love. And I also want to reiterate those 3 E's that you mentioned, because I think those are profound: environment, economy, and equity. And I think that is a great mantra that we all can have. If it's good for the environment, it's good for the economy, and it's equitable, if it's fair for people, that's a winning combination right there for sure.
And we win these fights, as I say, from the bottom up. It's, how do we save the planet? 400 acres at a time here in Richmond, 6 miles at a stretch there in Laguna Beach, and in the State House in Sacramento. I was talking to a scientist, and Kathy Boyer, who's the scientist who studies the eelgrass in the bay, she was complaining to me. She says, some politicians said that we could get carbon credits for planting new eelgrass, but the science isn't there yet. And I think that the native grass will sequester more carbon than new plantings. I go, wait a minute, Kathy. Stop at there's a politician introducing an eelgrass bill in the Capitol. California is kind of exceptional. She sort of, rolled her eyes and said, yeah, that's true. But, we need to scale it up. One of our local politicians, local here in Northern California, has just introduced the Kelp Act. Jared Huffman, whose district is the entire Northern California coastline. A lot of district to cover on a weekend when he's home. But he introduced this Kelp Act. It's because as much as you can do at the state level, California can't on its own stop climate change. And so we're seeing that the disasters we're now seeing in our ocean are climate related. I've been covering for National Geographic and other folks. I've been covering the wildfires the last few years. Just did that New York Times piece you mentioned about our other forest disaster that people are less aware of, which is, 95% of the kelp forest dead north of the Gate. And
yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. I mentioned in the opening this essay that the New York Times just ran. I'm a huge fan of healthy kelp forests. We're actually doing a big kelp cleanup here in Laguna Beach leading up to World Oceans Day here in a couple weeks. Let's talk about kelp in terms of its role in carbon drawdown. Tell us about the essay and why you wrote it, please.
Yeah, so I'm thinking kelp is the new coral. These are the places that are huge bioreserves, that they have complexity. Those of us who dive love to dive in coral reefs and love to dive in kelp forests because the incredible diversity of life you encounter. Yes. The corals need tropical, warm, clear waters, low nutrient, and the kelp forest like cold, nutrient-rich water. So they're kind of opposite ecosystems, both surprisingly fragile. And what happened here in California, starting in 2013, 2014, we had the blob. The scientists called it as a marine heat wave. And as I say, kelp thrives with our upwellings off California that are cold nutrient water.
That's right.
And they start dying off in warm water. So they started dying off at the same time, because there's always complexity in natural systems. At the same time, there was not a virus, but a disease, sea star wasting syndrome, that basically was like a horror movie. It just dissolved the arms of sea stars and wiped out most of the sea stars up and down the coast. Since we'd already wiped out most of the sea otters a century ago, these were the last predators on little purple urchins. So the kelp was already basically driven way back by the warm water. And then with the loss of their chief predator, the big sea stars, the little purple urchin came out and ate the holdfast, ate the roots of the kelp, wiped them out. And so where we had kelp forest 5 years ago, we now have what they call urchin barrens. It just looks like little purple pin cushions covering the bottom of the ocean. Yes. And it's crisis. And the environmental and economic impacts for fisheries, the abalone that people were free diving for became weak. The mussels, they just could peel off the rocks where they used to be solidly cemented to them through their muscles. So we're now in a situation where everybody's coming together, all the stakeholders, the fishermen and the state and the urchin divers, but they're working to come up with solutions. They're out there with hammers and suction, trying to clear out spaces of urchin, trying to get rid of the urchin. But Brian Tissot, who's longtime director of the Humboldt State Marine Lab, really thinks things won't change until ocean conditions change. There will be a return of cold nutrient water, which would help the kelp recover. But then there will be another marine heat wave, and it's just as long as we're putting carbon into the system, it's going to get hotter and drier and, and drier on land, hotter in the water, and things are going to go bad. So we're now at the stage where we failed. We failed to reduce carbon when we pledged to. And so we can no longer get to a safe zone, which the scientists say is 1.5 degrees Celsius warming. We can't do that just by cutting back at this stage. We're going to have to come up with creative ways of pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. A part of that's blue carbon. It's protecting and growing enough kelp and protecting and expanding salt marshes and seagrasses and other and living sequesterers. Everything that's living in the ocean from krill to blue whales also sequester carbon. On land, we have to change from agriculture that's industrial and emits carbon to regenerative agriculture that can absorb it. We need to reforest the land and restore corals in the ocean. And it's if ecosystem restoration has to become the major human endeavor of the next half of this century, if we got any chance. I luckily just came back from a place called Tetaroa in the South Pacific, French Polynesia, where I ran around for 2 days with a bunch of scientists who are creating a baseline. Then they're going to eradicate the invasive rats and see what happens. And they kind of know what will happen, which will be a tremendous restoration of sea turtle hatchlings who are being eaten by rats and seabirds whose eggs are being taken. And they expect seabird population will increase tenfold, which means more poop, more guano, which actually historically feeds the coral reefs. They like low nutrient, but they like a little bird poop in their diet. So there's this whole atoll where they plan to basically bring it back to a natural state. It's like when we introduced wolves in Yellowstone, and it was basically to keep the elk under control, but then it had other impacts. The elk stopped grazing the rivers, and suddenly you had willows and aspen growing back, and now there are all these small fur-bearing mammals like beavers and martens, and their beavers are changing the waterways, and everything's exploding with life in ways that scientists couldn't predict. Same thing's going to happen on this coral atoll, only now they've created a baseline of what's there before the rats and the fire ants are eradicated, and they can watch what comes back. And one of the scientists, he was like, Sebastian, is going, people are very dark, and they'll say, well, all the atolls are going away with sea level rise, so why bother? He says, but by the end of the century, 85% of the atolls will still be here. And these become models of how we restore island systems. And from island systems, we go to land systems and coastal systems, because the most dynamic places where the sea and the land intersect. And again, not hopeful. I'd say it's more like triage. We have the ability to save what we can while we can. I think it was Gramsci, the Italian philosopher, who said, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. Meaning that, when I get out of the water, I'm always optimistic. When I see dolphins, I think there can be more dolphins. When I see coral, I think there can be more coral. And when I see people, particularly young people, with a sense of wonder, then we just have to balance that wonder with the warning, and and commit to restoring what we can and protecting what we can, because nobody knows. We don't know if we're going to win or lose. All we know is if we don't try, we lose.
We have to try. And to go to back to your point from earlier, we know solutions here. It's not like we're just hanging out here to dry with we're screwed. There's nothing we can do about it. We know what can be done. You mentioned the sea stars. I can't remember. You'll know better. It was probably, I'm going to guess, 7-8 years ago. They pretty much disappeared overnight. They were gone. And I remember at that time, people saying they would never come back in our lifetime. I could walk you down to the tide pools in Laguna Beach right now. They're everywhere. So as fast as they were gone, they did come back. Again, a good example of when we leave things alone, the ocean and the environment will restore itself.
The sea stars are coming back. The kelp in there's bull kelp in Southern California and giant kelp in Northern. Reverse that, giant in Southern, bull in Northern. the recovery is visible in places Monterey South, and I think ocean conditions will see recovery in Northern California. But the problem is too much heat in the system. The problem is that things will go away, and we can't count. After BP disaster, they said, well, the microbes will eat all the oil, which is a way of saying we screwed it up. Leave it to nature to fix it. Yeah, exactly. That only lasts so long.
Yeah, our kelp right now, I posted something on Instagram yesterday of a video of a harbor seal, right, like almost nose to nose with me, and all the kelp in the background. I basically said, I've never seen the kelp as thick and lush as it is right now. And the reason, as you know, is the water's cold, and it's been cold. It never really warmed up even last summer, and it's still, I don't know, probably 62 degrees right now. So it's a good environment for lush kelp. You started answering my next question, which was about another article that you recently published after your 2021 dive trip to Tahiti and Moorea. So tell me a little bit more what occurred for you on that journey.
Okay. Awesome dive trip. Lifetime plan. I mean, I've been thinking of Tahiti since I was 11, and so I'm Mutiny on the Bounty.
Insular Tahiti, yes.
And, then you get a little older, you see Gauguin paintings, and eventually it was all about the diving that I'd heard. And last fall, really just 5 months ago, went with my dive buddy and board president, Dave Schwartz, and my nephew, Adam, and his girlfriend, Christina, and went to Moorea, Rangiroa, Whakarava. And it was just an awesome trip, but with a climate warning. I mean, first, the awesomeness was like you're 60 feet down and you look up, there's a pod of dolphins. You look down, there's a school of shark. The wild dolphins have started gloaming on to the divers in Rangiroa, so they just swim around you. Suddenly, one of them was, turns out, the son of the female that first got interested in the divers, like comes over and wants to be rubbed, wants a belly rub, stands vertical in the water. Then two of his buddies come along and look at him like, what are you doing with those strange humans? I swear this dolphin got embarrassed and took off with his buddies. But incredible life, abundant. When we got to Whakarava, it was right. They have these passes in both of those atolls where billions of gallons of waters go in and out with the tide, and it becomes like all the big pelagic creatures. It's like a shark train, hundreds of sharks and tuna and manta rays going in. At one point, I say they're shark-enhanced waters, not shark-infested. And at one point, we're on the edge of the coral at a drop-off. Hundreds of sharks, and in the distance, big 15-foot hammerhead with a huge dorsal. And suddenly, all the little 4 to 8 foot sharks panic and come running up on the reef with us. We surface at sunset, and there's just a moon and a star. We're in the pass and waiting for the RIB, the rigid hull inflatable, to come pick us up. We're inflated, our BCs, and Christina turns and goes, it was like that cross traffic, all those colorful fish on top of the reef. I thought that was just in Finding Nemo. I thought that was just animation. It's like, this is what it's based on. And yet, because I know to look, about a quarter of the reef is nuked, about a quarter of those reefs. Very isolated, very few humans to have impacts. There's no polluted runoff. There's no anchor damage, but either covered with algae or just coral rubble from big bleaching events, from warming water that's cumulatively. Rangiroa first got hit in 98, 99, which was the first global bleaching event recorded. And so even these pristine places that are still alive and still bring joy to your soul also bring warning that nothing's guaranteed, and we could in the end. I've raged against the dying of a reef. I've seen bleaching events in Florida and Hawaii and Fiji and Australia, and it doesn't have to be. It's, we're making bad choices today. Wind and solar are the cheapest energies that can be developed, cheaper than coal, cheaper than oil or gas, and yet, well, the market's there, the political will is not. And so we're fighting the largest industrial combine in human history to make progress for humanity and for all the millions of other species that we've put in danger. And most of them are, most of them live in salty water. The other 71% of our blue marble planet.
David, I admire your hope, and I'll admit there's plenty of days, including the last few, where my hope in humanity is dwindling, but my love for the whales, the dolphins, the harbor seals, the sea lions, as you know, we have more species of dolphins and whales off the coast of California than, especially Southern California, than anywhere in the world, up by you also. It's my love for these animals.
We have bigger sharks.
Yes, you can have those. But it's my love for these animals that are the victims in this situation.
Yep.
That's why I do what I do. That's what gets me up every morning, to get out in the water and have conversations like this, and to do what we do, with our work. It's really about that. So it's hard to retain hope for the humans when you see how we act, especially like you're saying, we know what we can do and we just don't have the political will to do it. It's sad.
Well, yeah, some Alaska senator once said, well, I don't care. Fish don't vote. So it's like, hey, people who care, the fish huggers are going to have to vote and going to have to do a lot more. It's kind of like aside from the climate emergency, we're in the 6th global extinction pulse. And the last one was 60 million years ago when a meteor took out the dinosaurs and let us small furry mammals start to dominate. Only now we're both the media and the planetary protection system. I mean, it's like large-brained apes now, beach apes, as my friend Jim Toomey calls them in his cartoon strip. It's up to us. We can have a sustainable future with some equity, or we can just keep having a system of, oligarchs and oligarchs and watch the collapse of what gives us hope and wonder. So I just think, what's the choice? The choice is we try and mobilize against the horrors of our times, or we accept them. And if we accept them, they continue and expand.
And I feel like that's why you do what you do. That's why I want to get into a little bit more on your books right now. Mm-hmm. I would imagine, well, actually, you tell me. You've written 6 books. We talked about some of them already. The War Against the Greens, which to me was kind of the foreshadowing of the future direction of your life's work, right? Investigating what was going on back in the early 90s. Why do you write? Is it healing for you? Is it your platform to get this message out there? What's important to you personally about writing?
It's just, it's where my passion is. I mean, I've my backgrounds, I've worked in radio. I've produced documentaries for a decade. I, have done lots of short form writing. I think books also are, one, you're responsible for them. I mean, I've been in situations where, thank God I'm writing, I don't have a camera crew here because things are falling apart in ways that you can't get the visual image that you need, but it's behind your eyes. You got it. And so, there's a craft that I just appreciate. It's a skill set that I have and need to share. And also books take on a life of their own. I think books are still a media that generates other media. Mm-hmm. I mean, I could work for a documentary for a year and it airs at 8 p.m. and, there's history at 9. Right. I work on a book and, it gives me an opportunity to explore new worlds. It gives you an excuse journalism has always given me an excuse to just sort of follow my curiosity. When I was doing the Coast Guard book, I'll admit I probably wrote a few more cutters and flew a few more helos than were absolutely necessary for the content. But, you want to get out there and see it firsthand and talk to the people who are doing it and get as close up as you can and then put it into prose that people can relate to. So, and I think it also helps with my ocean work because I think that, like you're saying, my ocean work is just, organizing events, what have you. It's a sense of responsibility. My ego is more invested in my writing. Mm. And, when I wrote like Saved by the Sea, it's like sort of 50 years, half a century of trauma me and the ocean have shared. And
I want to talk about Saved by the Sea. We've talked about War Against the Greens, Blue Frontier, which was the second one. We talked about 50 Ways, which was my introduction to you. You mentioned the Golden Shore, but I want to talk about Saved by the Sea. Mainly, I just love the title of it. And the reason I want to ask you this, one of the things I found interesting, like we've said a few times here, we know what we need to do. The question is, will we individually and as a collective take the actions that we need to do to protect the ocean and the planet? One of the things that I found enlightening, and you've probably seen the same thing in your podcast, which we can talk about also, because we've interviewed a lot of the same people, everybody has pretty much said the same thing. And like you, I've interviewed scientists, authors, filmmakers, politicians all across the board, and everybody says the same thing when I ask them, what's it really going to take to turn the tide? And the answer is an elevation in consciousness. So when I look at a book like Saved by the Sea, I mean, that title alone screams to me of your personal relationship with the ocean and how it's impacted you, not from a policy standpoint, but from a consciousness standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint. So it's a great title. I love it because the ocean has saved me many, many times also. Tell us more about this book and how have you personally been saved by the sea?
Well, the book sort of came out of I was asked to do a guest essay, a chapter in a book that was celebrating, anniversary of David Suzuki, famous Canadian. And I had an editor who just didn't know what they wanted, and they kept having me rewrite it. And finally I said, okay, it's not working for Orion Magazine. It might work for my agent. And then we sent it in, and it's the first time an editor sort of sent something back. Basically, I had a lot of my autobiography in it, and basically, in essence, he said, more fish, less Helvarg. So I sort of took out a lot of the war reporting and the private investigating and just focused on all the things that have connected me with the sea, which is really a kind of a theme throughout my life. I've always been attracted, sort of besotted by the ocean. And it worked. It worked in terms of it's a way to tell both a personal story and a greater story about the state of our blue marble planet. And I think that, and for the other stuff, my friend Steve Chappell said, well, now you can write a book, Ruined by the Land. But
a sequel to Saved by the Sea.
But maybe I could just, because it's very much what you were just saying, why don't I read the last page of it if I can?
Please, I love it.
Where I just say, it's sort of the conclusion that's also a wrap.
Go for it.
Well, I've gone from radical activist to war reporter, private investigator, TV producer, author, and activist again. I do so with a more sober assessment than when I was young, running wild in the streets, chanting power to the people, slogan appropriated for battery-powered Oral-B toothbrush. Today, I don't really expect a revolution in either politics or consciousness to radically alter the cascading ecological collapse of our ocean planet. I do, however, note a rising line of ecological mindfulness approaching the declining plane of biological diversity on our water world. Where that X crosses will tell us how much is left to save and restore if we can. I'm not sure it will be enough to turn the tide. All I know for certain is if we don't try, we lose. And this salty blue world of ours is too heart-achingly beautiful, scary, and sacred to lose. If you don't believe me, join the space program, travel out into the cosmos, and look back from the heavens. It's not God's green earth, it's God's blue marble. So I think that's the feeling we've got. We're in that space where it's maybe 2 generations in which we turn the corner or we don't. And if we don't, future generations, surviving generations of humanity will have no reason to forgive or forget our sins. But we're still in that moment where you can go out, where I can go out and look up and see dolphins and look down and see sharks and look into little crevices and see, whole panoramas of life taking place inside a barrel sponge. Or just for a quick thrill, get in the surf in San Diego and catch a wave and have that adrenaline. Because even the conditions of our shoreline, even our, classic point breaks are being damaged by changes we've wrought. So, it's a moment, and I think a lot of young people recognize it as a moment and are willing to go beyond the standard constructs, and we'll see what creativity we can do. I mean, we used to say, young people of the future, leaders. No, they're leaders today if we partner with them and mentor when they're asked us to. And, we just did a training for 70 young people with Earth Echo, and we're training them on how to write letters to the editor and or opinion pieces. And the first thing I did is explain, knowing they don't read newspapers, why that's important. Because, because politicians still read their local papers and the national papers, and policy is determined by what they see in the letters to the editor from their constituents or in the opinion sections. They're influenced in ways that, that a email campaign is not going to influence them. And so just communicating certain knowledge to young people who are ready to act and looking for ways to act decisively and to have power is a good thing. So I feel like, becoming an elder sounds better than just another old fart. So I'll take it.
I like that. Oh, okay. A few things come to mind as you were, first of all, as you were reading that, you talked about how it's not about revolution. And to me, that speaks to what I was saying, how the answer lies in an elevation of consciousness. To me, it's about evolution, not revolution. And then I wanted to ask you, and you already brought it up, about the youth. You mentioned earlier your Blue Vision Summit, which I believe you just came back from. You have a lot of youth conservationists involved in that summit. And also with your podcast, we've interviewed a lot of the same people, including Daniela Fernandez, who lives in Laguna now. She's 27 and amazing.
Yeah, she's getting old.
She's way up there. No, she's incredible, smart, as she's just an amazing human being. Danny Washington, who I believe is now very old. I think she is 30 now. Just kidding, yep. Danny, you're very young. So there's definitely some amazing young conservationists. Danny's a scientist. My question is, in your experience, especially with what you just experienced at the Blue Vision Summit, how concerned is the youth of this planet who stand to inherit that mess that we've created for them? I mean, you and I will probably be long gone before it gets potentially really bad. How concerned is the youth?
I don't know. Well, first I just came back from Blue Climate Summit, which wasn't ours, but was put on by this interesting group, the Tetiaroa Society out in the Pacific. Yeah. And had good youth representation. It was in Polynesia, and there were like 20 Polynesian youth involved, including young people who are doing coral restoration on many of the islands there. And how engaged the youth? It's hard to say. I mean, they're still not voting at the rates that old people are voting. I think it's sometimes a challenge to make the connection between that it's not one or the other. It's both an outside and an inside game. You both, march in the streets and through the halls of Congress or your state house. And that, to understand that change is multi-leveled. There's a lot of, and to understand history, that you may feel like you're the first generation who gets it, but it's happened before. And how do we bend back that curve that, we're not sure that history curves towards justice, but we know that it can occasionally, and we know it takes a lot of political drive. And again, just our particular challenge is, for those of us who love the ocean, is to make that connection that there's no climate solution without the ocean. There's no life without the ocean. It's the crucible of life on our planet. And it's tough because there are 8 billion of us, and on any given day there may be 50 million on the water, on and in the water. A fraction of the people actually have the direct experience. There's 20 million registered divers. On any given day, on the ocean, there's fishermen, there's maritime, workers in the shipping industry. There are 90,000 large vessels out there. There's the sailors of all the navies of the world, and there's some recreational people. It's a fraction of humanity that actually experiences the ocean as a daily part of their lives. And so making that connection, like my co-host Vicki Nichols Goldstein. She's the Inland Ocean Coalition,
That's
making
right,
those
Boulder.
connections.
Yep.
Yeah, and when she started doing ocean events in Boulder, I said it's like the most important ocean event in Colorado in 30 million years.
Or Mermaid Ball in Colorado, right?
But there are mermaids everywhere, and there are activists who are making the connections, you know, from the watersheds. We have one of our other Blue Frontier projects was sort of our ocean adventurers, which was Roz Savage, who solo took a rowboat across the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Ocean. But Margot, who's still an organizer with us, Margot Pellegrino, read 50 Ways to Save the Ocean, used our Blue Movement directory to make connections, and paddled from Miami to Maine in her outrigger. Then I convinced her to go from Seattle to San Diego, which she paddled, and then she paddled from New York to New Orleans because she recognized the connection wanted to make stronger connections between, you know, coastal activists and watershed activists. It's all water. All the issues are similar. So she paddled up the Hudson, across the Erie Canal, through the Great Lakes and down the river systems to New Orleans, and met all these people fighting for clean water. And whether it's salty, brackish, or fresh, the issues become the same, of nutrient pollution, of plastic pollution, of you know, unsound development that impacts your shoreline. So you know, a lot of it is just getting out there. And with the end of COVID, I mean, during COVID, we had 800 people on a ocean climate action, you know, podcast, Zoom meeting, with a range of folks who had, again, solutions, from folks in Miami to folks in the Senate. And we just, you know, we had 300 people doing a virtual lobby for our clean ocean, our ocean climate action plan. Had some impact, and, you know, then we hit a wall, and now we just have to shake ourselves off and kick our way through that wall. And we'll do it with young people. We'll do it because we have to. We do it because, like, now everybody's seeing the impacts of climate change in their lives. It's no longer a problem of the future. It's a problem of today. You can deny it all you want, but in South Carolina, they're calling it the, you know, the flooding crisis or the king tides crisis, but it's a climate crisis, and they're having to deal with it and having to address it. I mean, this is the new reality. I pitched a story to NatGeo to go with the Coast Guard 2 summers ago when it was going to be a more intensive hurricane season, and I ended up just leaving my house on a day when the sky was bright orange red, and traveling 100 miles to a major wildfire, because you no longer have to, you no longer have to travel to cover the climate disaster. It's come into a neighborhood near you. So it's you know, we've delayed too long. Now we got to deal with the disaster in front of us, and we have to find the ways to do to reprioritize. I mean, my last piece of the New York Times was on, we need to create a disaster response warfighting unit in the Pentagon, a 13th warfighting group, because they've got the deep pockets, and with the National Guard and the Coast Guard for leadership, they could do the kind of disaster response we need, which is to build out of the disasters new resiliency for the new reality we're facing. And hopefully at the end of it, it'll still look like Laguna Beach or Monterey Bay, where you can still go out. And I'm talking to, when I'm back east next week, I'm talking to some folks who are talking to surfers in Cape Cod who are all upset that the seals are back, therefore the white sharks are back. And these are surfers saying, let's kill the sharks. And it's like, dude, what kind of thinking is that? I mean, here in California, you just live with the man in the gray suit. And I mean, as a body surfer, my attitude's, if there's not something bigger and meaner than me out there, it's not really a wilderness. You know, we're all part of.
You bring up so many great points, that how few people are actually on and in the water every day. People, years ago, I used to get so much shit because I would post these videos of me paddleboarding with the dolphins, and I had NOAA agents come to my front door, and I was like, what's going on, guys? They're like, am I breaking any law? And they're like, no. I'm like, because I have videos of me 2 miles off the shore with 100-foot blue whales, and orcas. And I'm like, am I doing anything illegal? No. What are you concerned about? Well, so many people see these videos, we're afraid there's going to all of a sudden be hundreds of people out there with these animals. And I said, first of all, I was 2 miles offshore with these blue whales. Do you have any idea how many other people were out there? I said, let me tell you, none. But my point is, I've been paddleboarding every day here for 12 years. I was out there this morning. Do you know how many other people were out there?
Almost none.
None.
Yeah.
It's none or a handful. Like the amount of people that are actually out there, it's extremely minimal.
Okay, I'm coming down to Laguna Beach. There'll be 2 people out there.
I have a guest bedroom. I would love it, David. Let's absolutely do it. So, couple things before we wrap up. First of all, how can people best support you and Blue Frontier and the work that you are doing?
Well, first, go to bluefront.org, see what we are doing, and see what part of it engages you. And then just get in touch with us. Give us, drop us a line at info@bluefront.org, or drop me a line at helvarg@bluefront.org. We're doing a lot of stuff for the 20th anniversary. The Blue Beat's expanding. A lot of young people are really into media, and we could use help there, but also mobilizing the next phase of ocean climate action. We're just, locally, we're in a battle for the survival of 400 acres of gorgeous headlands here on San Francisco Bay. So, yeah, go to bluefront.org, find out what we're about, and join us. And if nothing else, we can help connect you with local activists and local groups in your area, because it's all about, as I say, building the Seaweed Rebellion, the marine grassroots. Power comes from the bottom up, and then the top down. Many years ago, I did a documentary at the 30 years ago this June at the Earth Summit in Rio. And one night, 30,000 people were marching through the streets, military overhead and helos. And it was a mix of international environmental activists who'd made their way there, poor people out of the favelas, all led by a big banner carried by Buddhist monks with cell phones. And the banner read, "When the people lead, the leaders will follow." So that's what the Seaweed Rebellion's about.
I love it.
And listen to, if you want the mini 30-minute ocean podcast, that's Rising Tide Ocean Podcast.
Well, we will share links to your website, to your podcast, to your summit, to everything that you're up to. I'm going to give you the final word here in a second, but I just want to thank you, David. I've been looking forward to this conversation ever since it was our mutual friend Sarah in her office down the street who gave me this book, which inspired me. And your work has always inspired me, so I've been looking forward to having this conversation. And the only thing I look forward to more is you actually coming to Laguna Beach and us getting out in the water together. I'll show you the kelp forest and introduce you to the local dolphins and the migrating whales, and we'll go out and get wet and have a blast. So, David, I appreciate you and everything that you do. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I just, when I was doing the Golden Shore book, another excuse to go drive the urban coast and the Redwood coast, and got to Laguna Beach, and it's like, oh, a bit of Caribbean stuck right here in Southern California. Beautiful. That same aquamarine water I fell in love with when I was 15. And I just think that, whenever it all gets too depressing, the news and the realities, try going to the beach, try getting in the water. It's really, it's soul healing, and it's physically healing, and it's a good way. Number one in my 50 ways to save the oceans, go to the beach, because as they always say, you protect what you love. And right now we're abusing our mom, we're abusing Mother Ocean, and we really need to turn things around fast. So that's what I'm working on, and I hope that's what we'll all be working on in the days and decades to come. Well,
then I'm doing my job, David, because I go to the beach every single day. That is our show, everybody. David, keep fighting the good fight. You are an amazing human being. We need more people like you. That's our show.
Thank you.
And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, David.